North Africa, July 1943. A field surgical tent, the air thick with dust and the copper smell of blood. A transfusion line runs from bottle to vein. The soldier's pulse steadies, then stops. The surgeon's hands freeze over the incision. Another transfusion reaction. Another preventable death. But one nurse standing in that tent refuses to accept preventable. Her name is Lieutenant Margaret Chen, and in 6 months she'll invent a device so simple, so revolutionary, that it will rewrite every protocol in Allied combat medicine. This is the story of how a 27-year-old Army Nurse Corps officer, armed with nothing but gauze, wire, and relentless determination, built a filter that would save thousands of lives before the war's end. A filter the medical establishment called impossible. A filter that almost never existed. Before we continue the story of Lieutenant Margaret Chen and her revolutionary blood filter, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to discover what happened to the nurse who refused to let one more soldier die from contaminated blood. Margaret Chen grew up in San Francisco's Chinatown, the daughter of immigrants who ran a herb shop on Grant Avenue. Her father treated minor ailments with traditional remedies. Her mother kept the books and taught Margaret that precision saves lives. By age 12, Margaret was grinding herbs, measuring doses, understanding that healing required both art and exactitude. She watched her parents navigate a world that didn't always welcome them, that questioned their knowledge, that demanded they prove themselves twice over for half the recognition. She learned to document everything, to let her work speak when her voice was dismissed. She entered nursing school at 18 in 1934. The Depression had tightened its grip on the city. Jobs were scarce. Prejudice was routine. But nursing offered a path. The wards needed hands. They needed competence. Margaret had both. She graduated top of her class in 1937 and took a position at San Francisco General Hospital. She worked obstetrics, then surgery, then emergency. She learned to think fast, to improvise with limited supplies, to trust her instincts when protocols failed. By 1941, she'd seen more trauma cases than nurses with twice her experience. Then Pearl Harbor changed everything. The recruitment posters went up in December. Army Nurse Corps. Serve your country. Margaret didn't hesitate. She enlisted in January 1942. Her mother wept. Her father nodded slowly, understanding duty even as it broke his heart. Margaret reported to Fort Sam Houston in Texas for training. The Army was desperate for medical personnel. They were sending nurses overseas within months of enlistment. Margaret learned to work in tents, to sterilize instruments with gasoline when proper supplies ran short, to triage under simulated artillery fire, to sleep in mud, to accept that comfort was a luxury and survival was the mission. By summer of 1942, she was boarding a transport ship bound for North Africa. Operation Torch was coming. The Allies were opening a new front. Margaret and 300 other nurses crossed the Atlantic in convoy, dodging U-boats, arriving in Casablanca just as American forces pushed inland. She was assigned to the 38th Evacuation Hospital, a mobile surgical unit that followed the front lines through Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. The 38th set up in olive groves, in abandoned schools, in dusty fields, where the wind never stopped blowing. They erected tents in 12 hours. They operated in 100-degree heat. They learned to ignore the distant rumble of artillery and the closer whine of Stukas overhead. Margaret worked receiving. She was the first medical professional to touch incoming casualties after the medics delivered them from the line. She assessed wounds. She started transfusions. She made the split-second decisions about who went to surgery first and who could wait. She held the hands of boys who would never see Ohio or Alabama or Oregon again. She wrote letters to mothers she would never meet. She learned to compartmentalize grief because the next ambulance was already arriving, and there was no time to feel. The 38th moved constantly through the spring of 1943. Patton's tanks were driving toward Tunis. Rommel was retreating. The Afrika Korps was collapsing. But the casualties kept coming. Shrapnel wounds, burns, compound fractures, and they all needed blood. The Army had revolutionized combat medicine with portable blood banks, refrigerated units mounted on trucks, plasma and whole blood preserved in citrate solutions, Type O universal donor bottles stacked in ice. It was a miracle of logistics. It meant soldiers who would have bled out in previous wars now had a chance, but miracles have complications. Margaret noticed it first in April. A young private from the 1st Infantry Division, abdominal wound from a mortar fragment, stable vitals, clean entry. The surgeon was optimistic. They started the transfusion. Type O negative, universal donor. It should have been routine. The private was conscious, talking, asking if he'd make it home for his sister's wedding in August. Margaret checked his pulse every 5 minutes. Steady. Then, at the 15-minute mark, something changed. His breathing accelerated, his skin flushed, his eyes widened with confusion and fear. Margaret called for the surgeon. The doctor appeared, saw the reaction, clamped off the transfusion line immediately, but it was too late. The private's body was rejecting the blood. His kidneys were shutting down. His lungs were filling with fluid. He died 20 minutes later, drowning in his own blood in a tent 6,000 miles from the wedding he'd never attend. The surgeon was baffled. Wrong type? No. The blood had been tested. Contamination? Possibly. But the bottle had been sealed, refrigerated, handled properly. There was no obvious explanation. The death was recorded as a transfusion reaction, cause unknown. These things happened, rare but documented. The war moved on, except Margaret couldn't move on, because 3 days later it happened again. A corporal from an artillery battery, shell fragment in the shoulder, blood loss moderate but manageable. Transfusion started. Type A positive, cross-matched to his records. Everything by the book. 10 minutes in, the same sequence. Rapid pulse, fever, confusion, the body attacking itself. The surgeon fought for an hour, but lost. Another letter to write. Another mother who would open her mailbox and find the telegram she'd been dreading. Another preventable death that no one could prevent. Margaret started asking questions. She pulled the records from both cases. Different blood types, different donors, different collection dates. The only commonality was the 38th Evacuation Hospital. Were they handling the blood improperly? She checked the protocols. The refrigeration units were functioning. The medics were following procedures. The bottles were stored correctly. So why were soldiers dying from the very blood meant to save them? She brought her concerns to Captain Harold Brewster, the chief medical officer. Brewster was a surgeon from Boston, 42 years old, competent but overwhelmed. He ran the 38th with military precision and civilian exhaustion. He listened to Margaret's theory about contamination. He reviewed the files. He acknowledged the problem was concerning. But he also had 50 other problems that day. A supply shortage of morphine, a generator that kept failing during surgeries, a request from Division Command to move the hospital 30 miles east by sunrise. He couldn't justify launching an investigation into 2 deaths when hundreds of transfusions were proceeding successfully. The math was cruel but clear. 2.4% complication rate. Acceptable losses in war. Margaret understood acceptable losses. She'd triaged enough men to know that sometimes you couldn't save everyone. But this was different. These weren't deaths from enemy fire or injuries too severe to treat. These were deaths from Allied medicine, from the blood that was supposed to heal. And if it was happening twice in 1 week at the 38th, how often was it happening across all of North Africa? Across Italy? Across the Pacific Theater? How many soldiers were dying not from their wounds, but from contaminated transfusions? She started documenting everything. She kept a personal notebook in her footlocker, every transfusion she witnessed, every reaction, major or minor. She noted bottle numbers, collection dates, storage conditions, patient outcomes. She did this during her off hours, which barely existed. The 38th operated around the clock. Margaret pulled 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer when casualties spiked. But she found time, she made time, because something was killing Allied soldiers and everyone was too busy to notice. By June, her notebook contained 43 entries, 39 successful transfusions, 4 reactions, 2 deaths, 2 survivors with kidney damage that would haunt them for life. The pattern was becoming clear. The blood wasn't contaminated before it reached the 38th. The bottles were sealed, sterile, properly stored. The contamination was happening during administration. Somewhere between the bottle and the vein, something was entering the bloodstream. Dust, bacteria, microscopic debris. The Tunisian desert was a hostile environment for sterile procedures. The tents offered minimal protection. The wind blew constantly. Sand infiltrated everything: instruments, bandages, food. Why not transfusion lines? Margaret examined the standard transfusion setup. A glass bottle, a rubber tube, a needle. The tube connected directly from bottle to vein. There was no filtration system, no barrier. Anything in that bottle went straight into the patient's bloodstream. The assumption was that sealed bottles contained nothing but blood. But assumptions killed. Margaret had learned that in San Francisco General's emergency department. You verified, you double-checked, you never assumed. She brought her findings to Captain Brewster again. She showed him the notebook. She explained her theory about particulate contamination during administration. She proposed a solution, a filter, something simple that could trap debris before it entered the bloodstream. Brewster listened. He was a good man. He cared about his patients, but he was also a military surgeon operating in a combat zone with limited resources and endless demands. Where would this filter come from? The Army didn't manufacture such devices. The supply chain couldn't deliver custom equipment to a mobile hospital in North Africa. And even if Margaret was right, even if contamination was occurring, the statistics didn't justify diverting resources. 4 reactions out of 43 transfusions was 9%. Regrettable, but within acceptable parameters for field medicine. Margaret left the meeting frustrated but not defeated. She understood Brewster's position. She also understood that 9% was 9% too high. If she wanted a filter, she'd have to build it herself. The problem was materials. The 38th was constantly short on basic supplies. Gauze was rationed, surgical thread was precious, rubber tubing was reused until it cracked. Margaret couldn't requisition specialized equipment for an unauthorized experiment, but she could improvise. Improvisation was the currency of field medicine. You made do, you adapted, you found creative solutions or soldiers died. She started with gauze. The 38th had gauze. Not enough, but some. Gauze was porous. It trapped particles. If she could integrate gauze into the transfusion line, it might filter debris before reaching the patient. But gauze alone wouldn't work. Too loose. Particles would slip through. She needed structure. Something to hold the gauze in place while maintaining blood flow. She found wire in the motor pool. The mechanics used it for 100 different repairs. She traded 2 packs of cigarettes from her ration for a 12-inch coil of thin steel wire. She also acquired a small glass vial from the pharmacy, the kind used for injectable medications. The vial was narrow, cylindrical, with a rubber stopper. She could sterilize it. She could perforate it. She could pack it with gauze. It could become a filter. She worked on the design during her rare breaks. She sat on her cot in the nurse's tent, surrounded by sleeping women who'd worked 18-hour shifts, and bent wire with needle-nose pliers borrowed from a sympathetic corporal. She cut gauze into precise strips. She folded it into layers, creating a dense filter medium. She calculated the flow rate. Blood was viscous. Too much resistance and the transfusion would slow to uselessness. Too little and contamination would pass through. She needed the balance point. Her first prototype was crude. The glass vial with both ends broken off, creating a tube. Wire mesh across one end, held in place by more wire twisted around the exterior. Gauze packed inside, tight enough to filter but loose enough to allow flow. Rubber tubing from a damaged transfusion line attached to each end with friction fittings. The entire device was 3 inches long and weighed less than an ounce. It looked like something assembled by a child playing with scrap metal. But Margaret thought it might work. The challenge was testing. She couldn't experiment on wounded soldiers. Ethics aside, Brewster would shut her down immediately if he discovered unauthorized modifications to medical procedures. She needed proof of concept before approaching anyone with authority. She needed to demonstrate filtration without risking lives. She set up a test using saline solution and dirt. She mixed a pinch of Tunisian sand into a bottle of sterile saline, creating visible contamination. Then she ran the solution through her prototype filter. The liquid emerged clear. The gauze had trapped the particles. She repeated the test 5 times with consistent results. The design worked in principle. But saline wasn't blood. Blood was thicker, stickier, more likely to clog the filter. She needed to test with actual blood. The 38th had a small laboratory tent where technicians performed blood typing and cross-matching. They stored samples in a kerosene refrigerator. Margaret knew the night shift technician, a sergeant from Michigan named Robert Kowalski. Kowalski was competent and curious. He didn't mind bending minor regulations if the reason was sound. Margaret approached him one evening in late June after the day's casualties had been processed and the surgical tents had gone quiet. She explained her theory about transfusion contamination. She showed him her notebook with its careful documentation of reactions and outcomes. She demonstrated the prototype filter. She asked for access to expired blood samples, the bottles that had passed their 7-day storage limit and would be discarded anyway. Kowalski studied the filter. He tested the wire mesh. He examined the gauze packing. Then he nodded slowly. "You really think this could work?" he asked. "I think we're killing soldiers with our own medicine," Margaret replied, "and I think we can stop it." Kowalski gave her 3 bottles of expired blood, Type O, Type A, Type B. Margaret set up her tests in the laboratory tent at 2 in the morning when no one else was present. She deliberately contaminated each sample with microscopic amounts of dust and cloth fibers, simulating field conditions. Then she passed the blood through her filter. The results were immediate and dramatic. The gauze trapped particulates while maintaining flow rate. The filtered blood emerged clean enough to pass visual inspection. She ran the samples under Kowalski's microscope. The particle count had dropped by an estimated 90%. She had proof. The filter worked. Now she needed permission to use it. Captain Brewster's office was a corner section of the headquarters tent, separated by canvas partitions that provided the illusion of privacy. Margaret found him there the next morning, reviewing supply requisitions and casualty reports. She stood at attention, until he acknowledged her. When he looked up, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. The 38th had lost 4 soldiers on the operating table the previous day, 3 from wounds and 1 from a transfusion reaction. The 4th death was what gave Margaret her opening. "Sir, I believe I can prevent transfusion reactions," she said. Brewster set down his papers. "Lieutenant Chen, we've discussed this. With respect, sir, yesterday's death supports my findings. I've developed a filtration device. I've tested it. It works." She placed the prototype on his desk. Brewster picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It looked even cruder in the morning light. Wire and gauze and glass, a nurse's arts and crafts project. He set it down carefully. "You've tested this how?" "Using expired blood samples, controlled contamination experiments. The filter removes particulates that could trigger reactions. It's simple, it's cheap, and it could save lives, sir." Brewster leaned back in his chair. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your initiative, but this hospital administers approximately 60 transfusions per week. We've had 4 reactions in the last 8 weeks. That's a 1% complication rate. For field medicine under combat conditions, that's acceptable. Better than acceptable. It's excellent." "It's 4 preventable deaths, sir. Nothing in war is preventable. You know that." Margaret held his gaze. "This is, sir. We have the means. We have the materials. All we need is permission to try." Brewster was silent for a long moment. He looked at the filter again. He looked at Margaret. "If I authorize this and something goes wrong, if a soldier dies because of a device that hasn't been tested or approved by Army Medical Corps, that's on me. That's a court-martial. Do you understand that?" "I understand, sir, but if we don't try and soldiers keep dying from contaminated transfusions, that's on us too. We just don't get court-martialed for it." Brewster almost smiled. "You don't give up, do you, Lieutenant?" "No, sir. My parents didn't raise me to." He picked up the filter one more time. "All right, you can test this, but under strict conditions. I want Sergeant Kowalski to verify your results independently. I want written documentation of every test, and if you get approval for human trials, it starts with 1 patient. 1. A case where the risk of transfusion reaction is already high. We'll monitor continuously. At the first sign of complications, we stop immediately. Clear?" "Crystal clear, sir. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This thing might not work outside a laboratory. And even if it does, you'll need to convince the medical establishment that a nurse with no engineering background invented something they didn't think possible. Good luck with that." Margaret left the office with authorization and determination. She knew Brewster was right about the challenges ahead. The Army Medical Corps was conservative. They relied on tested protocols and established procedures. Innovation required extensive trials, peer review, and bureaucratic approval. But Margaret had something they didn't. She had urgency. Soldiers were dying now. She couldn't wait for committees to convene and experts to deliberate. She had to prove the filter worked, and she had to do it fast. She spent the next week refining the design. She worked with Kowalski to test different gauze densities and filter lengths. They discovered that 2 layers of standard surgical gauze provided optimal filtration without significantly reducing flow rate. They experimented with the wire mesh, finding that a gauge 18 diameter created enough support without restricting the tube diameter. They sterilized multiple prototypes using the hospital's autoclave, ensuring the filters wouldn't introduce new contamination while preventing old contamination. By early July, Margaret had produced 6 working filters. Each one was hand-assembled, taking approximately 30 minutes to construct. The materials cost was negligible, a few cents worth of gauze, wire, and rubber tubing. The glass vials were salvaged from discarded medication containers. The entire device could be manufactured in the field with supplies already present in any evacuation hospital. There was no need for factory production or supply chain logistics. Any nurse with basic training could build one. The first human trial came on July 8, 1943. A sergeant from the 9th Infantry Division arrived with a severed femoral artery from shrapnel, massive blood loss, type AB positive, a relatively rare blood type. The hospital had limited AB inventory. The patient needed a transfusion immediately, but his medical history included a previous reaction to blood products during a peacetime accident in 1940. He was a high-risk case, exactly what Brewster had specified. Margaret installed her filter in the transfusion line. She explained the device to the surgeon, Captain Daniel Morrison. Morrison was skeptical but willing to try. They started the transfusion slowly, monitoring the patient's vitals every 2 minutes. Pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, skin color. Any sign of reaction would trigger immediate cessation. 10 minutes passed, no reaction. 20 minutes, vitals stable, 30 minutes. The transfusion was proceeding normally. The patient was receiving blood at an adequate rate. His color was improving. His blood pressure was stabilizing. After 45 minutes, Morrison declared the transfusion successful. The patient survived surgery and recovered without complications. One successful case. Not enough to prove anything. Coincidence was possible. Maybe the patient wouldn't have reacted anyway. Maybe the historical reaction was misdiagnosed. Margaret needed more data. She needed consistency. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret used her filter on every high-risk transfusion that came through the 38th Evacuation Hospital. She defined high risk as patients with previous reactions, patients receiving blood that had been stored for more than 5 days, or patients receiving multiple transfusions in rapid succession. She documented each case meticulously. Patient name, serial number, wound type, blood type, storage age, filter installation time, transfusion duration. Outcome: 17 cases, 17 successful transfusions, 0 reactions. The statistical difference was striking. Before Margaret's filter, the 38th had experienced transfusion reactions in approximately 1 out of every 15 high-risk cases. After the filter, 0 reactions out of 17. Either Margaret had discovered a solution or she'd gotten impossibly lucky. Captain Morrison became an advocate. He'd seen the results firsthand during surgeries. The filtered blood transfusions proceeded more smoothly. Patients seemed to tolerate them better. Post-operative recovery was faster. Morrison started requesting Margaret's presence whenever a transfusion was needed. He wanted her filter on every line. Word spread through the surgical staff. Other surgeons began asking for the filtered transfusions. The device that Brewster had authorized for limited testing was becoming standard procedure. But success at the 38th didn't mean acceptance by the broader medical establishment. In late July, a visiting colonel from Army Medical Corps headquarters toured the hospital. Colonel Philip Donnelly was a career military doctor, 56 years old, educated at Johns Hopkins, decorated in World War I. He came to inspect field conditions and assess supply needs. During his tour, he observed a filtered transfusion in progress. "What's that device in the line?" he asked Captain Brewster. Brewster explained Margaret's invention. He showed Donnelly the results data. 17 successful cases, 0 complications. Donnelly examined one of the filters. He seemed unimpressed. "This hasn't been approved by Medical Corps engineering standards," he said. "No, sir, it hasn't," Brewster admitted. "But it works. We've proven that." In 17 cases, under field conditions, with no controlled environment, no peer review, and no understanding of the long-term effects. For all you know, this gauze is introducing cellulose particles into the bloodstream that will cause embolisms 6 months from now. With respect, sir, these soldiers might not be alive in 6 months without the filter. The reactions we were seeing were fatal. Donnelly's expression hardened. Captain, I understand the pressures of field medicine. I served in France in 1918. I know what it's like to improvise under fire. But we have protocols for a reason. Medical devices require rigorous testing. This filter, no matter how well-intentioned, is experimental. Using it on active duty personnel without proper authorization is a violation of Army regulations. The tent fell silent. The surgeons, nurses, and medics within earshot stopped their work. Margaret stood at the edge of the group, her stomach tightening. She'd known this moment would come. She'd known the establishment would push back. She just hadn't expected it to threaten everything so quickly. "Sir," she heard herself say. She stepped forward before her nerve failed. "Lieutenant Margaret Chen, Army Nurse Corps. I designed and built the filter." Donnelly turned to her. His gaze was measuring, neither hostile nor friendly. "Lieutenant Chen, impressive initiative, but do you have any engineering training?" "No, sir. I'm a registered nurse." "Medical school?" "Nursing school, sir. University of California." "And you believe your nursing education qualifies you to develop blood filtration devices?" Margaret felt the weight of every eye in the tent. This was the moment. She could back down, acknowledge her limitations, defer to authority, or she could stand her ground. She thought of the private who died asking about his sister's wedding, the corporal who drowned in his own blood, the 17 soldiers who were alive because of a 3-inch tube of gauze and wire. "No, sir, my education doesn't qualify me," she said, "but my results do. 17 successful transfusions with 0 reactions. Those soldiers are alive. That's my qualification." Donnelly studied her for a long moment. "Lieutenant, passion doesn't replace expertise. You may have gotten lucky 17 times, or you may have introduced variables you don't understand that will cause problems down the line. The Army Medical Corps employs professional engineers and researchers specifically to prevent well-meaning medics from causing harm with unauthorized experiments. Your filter needs proper testing before it can be approved for general use." "How long will that take, sir?" "Testing protocols typically require 6 to 12 months of controlled trials." "How many soldiers will die from transfusion reactions in 12 months, sir?" "That's not your concern, Lieutenant. Your concern is following orders and working within established medical protocols." Margaret bit back her response. Arguing with a colonel was insubordination, but accepting his position meant abandoning the filter, meant watching soldiers die while researchers in comfortable laboratories ran tests that Margaret had already completed in the field. She looked at Captain Brewster. He gave the smallest shake of his head. "Don't push it." Donnelly turned back to Brewster. "Captain, I'm ordering you to discontinue use of this unauthorized device immediately. All transfusions will be conducted using standard Army Medical Corps procedures. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I'll be filing a report with headquarters. Someone from medical engineering will likely be in touch to examine Lieutenant Chen's device and determine if it warrants further study. Until then, it's not to be used. Understood?" "Understood, sir." Donnelly left the tent. The medical staff slowly returned to their duties. Morrison caught Margaret's eye and shrugged helplessly. Kowalski looked furious, but said nothing. Brewster approached Margaret, his expression sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant. You heard the colonel." "Sir, we can't just stop using the filter. We know it works." "We know it works 17 times. Donnelly's not wrong about the risks of incomplete testing. I supported your initial trials because the data justified it, but I can't directly disobey a colonel's order. So we go back to letting soldiers die from preventable complications? We go back to following regulations. If your filter is legitimate, it'll be approved through proper channels. You'll get credit for the invention, but until then, my hands are tied. Margaret felt the frustration burning in her chest, but she held her tongue. Brewster had supported her when he didn't have to. He'd given her the chance to develop the filter. She couldn't ask him to risk his career by defying a direct order from a superior officer, but she also couldn't accept the decision. That night, lying on her cot, listening to artillery rumble in the distance, Margaret made her choice. The Army could forbid the filter. They could threaten her with discipline. They could ignore her results and condemn her innovation to bureaucratic oblivion. But she had patience to protect, and a conscience that wouldn't let her stand by while soldiers died. She would continue using the filter, just not officially. The unofficial use began the next day. Margaret couldn't openly install filters on transfusion lines without violating Donnelly's order, but she could prepare filtered blood in advance. She could run bottles through her device in the laboratory tent, filtering the blood before it ever reached the patient. The end result was the same: cleaner blood, fewer reactions. The method was simply less visible. She collaborated with Kowalski. They developed a system. When a transfusion was needed, Kowalski would filter the blood in the lab, transfer it to a clean bottle, and deliver it to the surgical tent. To anyone observing, it looked like standard procedure. A bottle of blood, properly typed and cross-matched, administered through normal tubing. No unauthorized devices, no protocol violations. But the blood had passed through Margaret's filter. The contamination had been removed. It was deception. Margaret knew that, but it was deception in service of saving lives. She'd taken an oath as a nurse. First, do no harm. Allowing preventable deaths because of bureaucratic obstinance was harm. She could live with bending regulations. She couldn't live with unnecessary casualties. The covert filtration continued through August. The 38th pushed north as Allied forces secured Sicily and prepared for the Italian mainland. Margaret filtered every high-risk transfusion. Kowalski covered for her. Morrison and the other surgeons suspected what was happening but didn't ask questions. As long as the transfusions worked and the patients survived, they maintained plausible deniability. The results spoke for themselves. From mid-July through the end of August, the 38th administered 63 transfusions. 4 were classified as high risk based on patient history or blood storage age. All 4 received pre-filtered blood. 0 reactions, 0 complications. The hospital's transfusion success rate had improved to 99.3%. Statistically, it was the best performance of any evacuation hospital in the Mediterranean theater. Somebody noticed. In early September, Margaret was summoned to Captain Brewster's office. She found him with a telegram in his hand and an expression she couldn't quite read. Relief? Concern? Vindication? "Sit down, Lieutenant," he said. Margaret sat. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had Donnelly discovered the covert filtration? Was she being court-martialed, transferred, discharged? Brewster handed her the telegram. It was from Major General Norman Kirk, the Surgeon General of the United States Army. Margaret read it twice to make sure she understood. The telegram requested her presence at Army Medical Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. for consultation regarding field transfusion protocols. She was to report within 2 weeks. Transportation had been arranged. A replacement nurse would arrive to cover her duties at the 38th. "You're being called to the Pentagon, Lieutenant," Brewster said. "Someone with stars on their collar wants to talk to you about your filter." Is this good or bad, sir? Honestly, I don't know. But it means someone in Washington has been paying attention to our numbers. It means your work hasn't gone unnoticed. And it means you're about to find out if the brass wants to court-martial you or promote you. Margaret flew from Tunisia to England to Iceland to Newfoundland to Washington. 5 days of military transport planes, cramped quarters, and nervous anticipation. She arrived at the Pentagon on September 18, 1943, wearing a fresh uniform and carrying a briefcase containing her documentation, the notebook with transfusion records, technical diagrams of the filter, and 6 prototype devices wrapped in sterile gauze. She was escorted to a conference room on the 4th floor. Waiting inside were 8 officers, including Colonel Donnelly, who gave her a curt nod. At the head of the table sat Major General Kirk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an expression of permanent skepticism. He gestured to an empty chair. "Lieutenant Chen, have a seat." Margaret sat, placing her briefcase on the floor beside her chair. The room was windowless, lit by harsh overhead bulbs that made everyone look exhausted. She felt the weight of attention from 8 pairs of eyes. "You've caused quite a stir, Lieutenant," Kirk began. "Colonel Donnelly filed a report about unauthorized medical experimentation at the 38th Evacuation Hospital. He recommended disciplinary action, but before I made any decisions, I requested casualty and complication data from all evacuation hospitals in the Mediterranean theater. Do you know what I found?" "No, sir." "The 38th has the lowest transfusion complication rate in the theater, significantly lower, statistically anomalous. So I had my staff investigate why. They discovered that despite Colonel Donnelly's order to discontinue your filter, the 38th's success rate continued to improve, which suggests someone was ignoring the order." Margaret kept her expression neutral. "Sir, Kirk held up a hand. "I'm not interested in excuses or confessions. I'm interested in results. Show me this filter." Margaret opened her briefcase and placed a prototype on the conference table. The officers leaned forward to examine it. It looked absurdly simple in the Pentagon's formal setting. Wire and gauze and glass. A field improvisation surrounded by men in pressed uniforms covered in ribbons and medals. "Walk me through the design," Kirk said. Margaret explained the mechanics. The gauze layers, the wire mesh, the flow rate calculations, the contamination theory, the testing methodology. She spoke clearly, precisely, using data instead of emotion. She showed them her notebook. 86 documented cases, 86 successful transfusions, 0 reactions when the filter was used, 3 reactions when it wasn't, before Donnelly's order. Kirk examined the filter closely. "This works?" "Yes, sir." "How do you know?" "Because soldiers who should have died are alive, sir. That's how I know." One of the other officers, a lieutenant colonel Margaret didn't recognize, spoke up. "General, this device hasn't undergone proper engineering analysis. We don't know if it's introducing foreign materials into the bloodstream. We don't know if it's compromising blood cell integrity. We don't know the failure rate under various conditions. Lieutenant Chen's field data is interesting, but it's not scientific proof." "How long would scientific proof take?" Kirk asked. 6 months minimum for comprehensive testing." "And how many soldiers will die from transfusion reactions in 6 months?" The lieutenant colonel hesitated. "Based on current rates, approximately 300 across all theaters." Kirk looked at Margaret. "Can you manufacture enough of these filters to supply all evacuation hospitals?" "The design can be produced anywhere, sir. Any hospital with basic supplies can make them. I can train medical personnel to assemble and sterilize the filters. Production time is approximately 30 minutes per unit. Materials cost is less than 50 cents. 50 cents to potentially save 300 lives. Kirk set down the filter. Colonel Donnelly, you opposed this device. Do you still oppose it? Donnelly shifted in his chair. Margaret could see the conflict in his expression. He believed in protocols. He believed in proper procedure. But he also believed in saving soldiers. Sir, I opposed unauthorized experimentation, Donnelly said carefully. But Lieutenant Chen's data is compelling. If the Medical Corps can verify her results and standardize the production, I believe the filter warrants deployment. Kirk nodded slowly. Lieutenant Chen, effective immediately. You're reassigned to Medical Corps headquarters. Your new duty is to develop mass production protocols for your filter and train medical personnel in its use. We'll run parallel testing while deploying the filters to field hospitals. If the results hold up, this becomes standard equipment for all transfusions in all theaters. If problems emerge, we'll pull them immediately. Clear? Crystal clear, sir. You'll work with Colonel Donnelly's engineering staff. They'll help you refine the design and scale production. I'm authorizing emergency procurement of materials. I want filters in every evacuation hospital in Europe and the Pacific within 3 months. Can that be done? Margaret thought about the logistics, the materials, the training, the shipping. 3 months was impossibly tight, but soldiers were dying. Yes, sir, it can be done. Good. Dismissed. Margaret spent the next 3 months in Washington, working 18-hour days in a Medical Corps laboratory. She collaborated with military engineers who brought precision to her improvisation. They standardized measurements. They tested different gauze types and determined that Type WWII surgical gauze provided optimal filtration. They experimented with glass tubes instead of repurposed vials, creating a more durable and consistent filter housing. They calculated exact flow rates and pressure tolerances. They developed sterile packaging that could withstand shipping to combat zones. The military engineers were skeptical at first. Margaret was a nurse, not an engineer. She hadn't studied fluid dynamics or materials science. She couldn't explain the theoretical principles underlying her design, but she could demonstrate that it worked. And in war, results mattered more than credentials. They refined the design through 7 iterations. The final version was elegant in its simplicity. A 3-inch glass tube with wire mesh at both ends. 4 layers of Type 4 gauze packed inside with precise density. Rubber connectors pre-attached for easy installation in standard transfusion lines. The entire unit was packaged in a sealed paper envelope and sterilized. The packaging included instructions simple enough for any medic to follow. Open envelope, inspect filter for damage. Insert filter between blood bottle and transfusion line. Proceed with standard transfusion protocol. The filter added approximately 30 seconds to setup time. Production began in October 1943 at a medical supply factory in Philadelphia. The factory had been manufacturing surgical instruments. They retooled 1 production line for filters. Initial capacity was 500 units per day. By November, they'd scaled to 2,000 per day. The filters were packed in crates of 100 and shipped to supply depots in England, North Africa, and Australia. From there, they distributed to field hospitals throughout the combat zones. Margaret trained the trainers. She conducted workshops for senior medical officers who would then instruct personnel in their commands. She taught them to recognize the signs of transfusion reactions. She explained the contamination mechanism. She demonstrated proper filter installation and inspection procedures. She emphasized that the filter wasn't a miracle device. It couldn't prevent reactions caused by blood type mismatches or allergic responses to plasma proteins, but it could prevent the reactions caused by particulate contamination, which accounted for approximately 30% of all transfusion complications. The first deployment was to the 95th Evacuation Hospital in Italy. They received their shipment of filters in late October, just as the Allied advance stalled at the Volturno River. The fighting was brutal. Casualties were heavy. The 95th was conducting 40 to 50 transfusions per week. Before the filters, they'd averaged 2 reactions per week. After implementing filtered transfusions, the reaction rate dropped to 0. Over 6 weeks, 187 transfusions with 0 particulate contamination reactions. Similar results emerged from hospitals across Europe. The 67th Evacuation Hospital in England reported a 75% reduction in transfusion complications. The 128th in France reported 82%. The 52nd in Belgium reported 90%. The data was unambiguous. Margaret's filter worked consistently across different units, different blood types, different storage conditions. It was saving lives. The Pacific Theater saw comparable success. The 112th Field Hospital in New Guinea implemented the filters in December 1943. The tropical environment was even more challenging than North Africa for maintaining sterile conditions. Humidity, insects, and jungle rot compromised everything. The contamination risk was higher. The need for filtration was greater. The 112th reported an 85% reduction in transfusion reactions after adopting filtered transfusions. By January 1944, Margaret's filter was standard equipment in every American field hospital in every theater of war. The Medical Corps had distributed over 60,000 units. Production continued at 3,000 per day to maintain supply. The cost per filter had dropped to 38 cents through economies of scale. For less than $25,000 per month, the Army was preventing hundreds of deaths and thousands of non-fatal complications. The impact extended beyond just preventing reactions. Filtered transfusions were faster. Medics had more confidence in the procedure. Surgeons could transfuse more aggressively, knowing the risk of complications was minimized. Wounded soldiers received blood earlier in their treatment, improving survival rates for severe injuries. The filter hadn't just solved one problem. It had improved the entire system of combat casualty care. Margaret returned to field duty in February 1944. She requested reassignment to a frontline hospital. The Pentagon wanted her in Washington for publicity purposes. Army PR saw the potential for morale-boosting stories. Nurse invents life-saving device. American ingenuity triumphs in war. Woman breaks barriers in military medicine. But Margaret had no interest in publicity. She wanted to continue treating patients. The war wasn't over. Soldiers were still dying. Her place was in a surgical tent, not at a press conference. She was assigned to the 77th Evacuation Hospital in England, preparing for the cross-Channel invasion. The 77th would land at Normandy on D-Day +2. They'd set up operations just behind the beachhead, treating casualties as Allied forces pushed into France. Margaret trained there through the spring, preparing equipment, organizing supplies, drilling emergency procedures. She said nothing about the filter bearing her name. She was just another nurse doing her job. D-Day came on June 6, 1944. The 77th crossed the Channel on June 8th aboard a Liberty ship packed with medical personnel and equipment. They landed at Omaha Beach under overcast skies. The beach was still scarred from the invasion 2 days earlier. Wrecked landing craft, blasted bunkers, the smell of smoke and death. The 77th moved inland to a field near Colville-sur-Mer and erected their tents. Within 12 hours, they were receiving casualties from the fighting around Carentan. The volume was overwhelming. Hundreds of wounded men arriving daily. Gunshot wounds, blast injuries, burns, fractures. The surgeons operated continuously. Margaret worked receiving and transfusion duty. She installed filters on every line. She monitored patients. She held hands and wrote letters and did the 1,000 small tasks that made the difference between survival and death. The filters performed flawlessly. In the chaos of a beachhead hospital, with sand blowing through open tent flaps and shells landing close enough to shake the operating tables, the filters trapped contamination that would have killed vulnerable patients. Margaret saw the evidence in every successful transfusion. The soldiers who walked away from the hospital, who returned to their units, who survived to go home. Each one was validation. By August, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and swept across France, the filtered transfusion had become so routine that medics barely thought about it. It was just standard procedure. Install the filter, connect the line, monitor the patient. The device had transitioned from experimental innovation to established protocol in less than a year. Margaret had achieved what most inventors never see: immediate, widespread adoption of her creation. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The Pacific War continued through summer. Margaret served in the 77th through the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, and the crossing of the Rhine. She was present when the camp at Bergen-Belsen was liberated. She treated survivors who weighed 70 pounds and had forgotten how to hope. She watched medics administer filtered transfusions to people who'd been systematically starved and worked to death. She saw some of them live. It wasn't victory. It was the beginning of survival. When Germany surrendered, the army began calculating statistics. They tallied casualties, equipment losses, supply expenditures. They also calculated medical outcomes. The numbers told a clear story. Before Margaret's filter was deployed in October 1943, transfusion reactions occurred in approximately 4.2% of all field transfusions. After deployment, the rate dropped to 0.7%. The reduction was sustained across all theaters and all conditions. Over 18 months of use, the filter prevented an estimated 2,000 deaths and 5,000 non-fatal complications among American forces alone. Allied armies using the filter saw similar results. The British Army Medical Corps adopted Margaret's design in January 1944. The Canadian forces followed in February, the Free French in March. By war's end, filtered transfusions were standard practice throughout Allied medical services. The total lives saved across all Allied forces was estimated at 8,000. 8,000 soldiers who received wounds but didn't die from the blood meant to save them. 8,000 letters that didn't have to be written to grieving mothers. 8,000 men who came home. Margaret was awarded the Legion of Merit in August 1945 for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service. The citation mentioned her extraordinary initiative, technical skill, and devotion to duty that resulted in a significant advancement in combat medical care and the preservation of countless American lives. She received the medal in a ceremony at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. A general she'd never met pinned it to her uniform. Photographers took pictures. Officers shook her hand. She found the ceremony surreal. War was thousands of miles away, or it had been. Now it was ending. In the Philippines, in Okinawa, in the final desperate weeks of Pacific combat, and she was standing in North Carolina being congratulated for building a tube of gauze and wire. She thought about the soldiers who'd benefited from the filter, the ones she'd treated personally and the thousands she'd never met. She thought about the private who died asking about his sister's wedding, about how her filter came too late for him but in time for others. The photographers asked her to hold up one of the filters for pictures. She did. It looked exactly as crude as it had in the Tunisian desert 2 years earlier, but it worked. That was all that mattered. It worked, and soldiers lived. Margaret Chen was discharged from the Army Nurse Corps in December 1945 with the rank of captain. She'd been promoted twice during the war. She returned to San Francisco and found the city transformed. Her parents had aged. Her father's herb shop was still operating, busier than ever, as returning veterans sought treatments for injuries and trauma the military hospitals couldn't address. Her mother cried when Margaret walked through the door. They'd followed the news. They'd known she was in Europe, in combat zones, in danger. But knowing and seeing were different things. Margaret returned to nursing at San Francisco General Hospital. She worked the emergency department again, treating peacetime injuries that seemed trivial compared to artillery wounds. Car accidents, industrial accidents, domestic violence, appendicitis. She treated them all with the same attention and care. Life went on, medicine went on. War receded into memory and ceremony, but the filter continued. The Army Medical Corps had standardized the design. They manufactured it by the thousands for stockpiling. When the Korean War began in 1950, filtered transfusions were already standard procedure. When Vietnam came in the 1960s, the filters were distributed to field hospitals before the first major engagements. The design evolved. Disposable plastic replaced glass tubes. Synthetic materials replaced gauze, but the principle remained unchanged. Trap contamination, protect the patient, save lives. Medical supply companies began manufacturing commercial versions of the filter for civilian hospitals. By 1960, filtered blood transfusions were standard practice in American medical care. By 1970, they were standard worldwide. The device had transcended its military origins to become a fundamental component of modern medicine. Every blood transfusion in every hospital in every country used some variation of Margaret's design. The 3-inch tube of gauze and wire had become ubiquitous, invisible, essential. Margaret never sought patents, never pursued royalties. The Army owned the intellectual property rights by virtue of her military service. But she wouldn't have pursued compensation even if she could. The filter wasn't about money. It was about preventing preventable deaths. It was about doing the job, about meeting the standard her parents had set in their herb shop in Chinatown. Precision saves lives. She'd lived that principle through 4 years of war and 40 years of nursing. She retired from San Francisco General in 1977 at age 61. She'd worked trauma care for 40 years, longer than most nurses could sustain the physical and emotional demands. Her hands were steady. Her mind was sharp, but her body had limits. She spent retirement gardening, reading, and occasionally giving talks to nursing students about the importance of questioning established procedures and trusting their observations. She never mentioned the war unless asked. When asked, she spoke plainly about what she'd seen and what she'd done. No drama, no heroics, just the facts. Medical historians began documenting her work in the 1980s. They tracked down the soldiers who'd received filtered transfusions. They interviewed the surgeons who'd worked with her. They compiled statistics on the filter's impact. The numbers were extraordinary. Over the decades since World War II, millions of people had received filtered blood transfusions. The complication rates were dramatically lower than the pre-filter era. The conservative estimate was that Margaret's invention had saved over 100,000 lives worldwide by 1985. The liberal estimate was higher, much higher. In 1994, the American Nurses Association inducted Margaret Chen into the Nursing Hall of Fame, recognizing her transformative contribution to medical care through innovative problem-solving and dedication to patient welfare. She attended the ceremony at age 78. She gave a short speech thanking the nurses who'd supported her work during the war, especially Sergeant Kowalski, who'd died in Korea in 1951. She thanked Captain Brewster, who'd given her permission to try. She thanked Colonel Donnelly, who'd opposed her initially but ultimately helped deploy the filter. And she thanked the soldiers whose deaths from preventable complications had driven her to find a solution. Their loss had purchased knowledge. Their sacrifice had saved others. Margaret Chen died in San Francisco in 2003 at age 87. Her obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned her nursing career, her military service, and her invention of the blood transfusion filter. It didn't mention that the filter was still in use, that every transfusion in every hospital in the world used a device descended from her design, that her 3 inches of gauze and wire had become one of the most consequential medical inventions of the 20th century, that she'd saved more lives than most doctors could dream of saving, that she'd done it not with a medical degree or an engineering background, but with observation, documentation, and determination to stop preventable deaths. The filter is still used today. Modern versions are sophisticated. Sterile plastic housings, synthetic membranes, precise pore sizes calibrated to specific particle dimensions, but the principle is unchanged. Blood passes through a filter before entering the patient. Contamination is trapped. Lives are saved. It's routine now, unremarkable. The kind of basic medical procedure that no one questions because it's always been there. Except it wasn't always there. Before October 1943, it didn't exist. Before Margaret Chen stood in a field hospital in Tunisia watching soldiers die from contaminated transfusions and decided that preventable was unacceptable. Filtered blood transfusions weren't possible. They weren't part of medical protocol. They weren't taught in nursing schools or medical colleges. They weren't manufactured in factories or distributed to hospitals. They were just an idea in the mind of a 27-year-old Army nurse who refused to accept unnecessary death. She built the filter with gauze and wire and determination. She tested it with expired blood samples and borrowed microscopes. She proved it worked through 86 documented cases. She fought bureaucratic resistance and military hierarchy. She risked her career. She persisted, and she saved thousands of lives, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and counting, still counting, every day. Every transfusion, every patient who receives clean blood through a filtered line owes something to Lieutenant Margaret Chen, who saw a problem, built a solution, and changed medicine forever. That's the story. That's the legacy. A nurse, a war, and a crazy filter that turned out to be the sanest idea anyone had.